Hi, welcome to this virtual session for the Tombolo Multicultural Festival about rug hooking. So my name is Emily Sopkowe. I have been rug hooking for about 10 years. I started off, actually taught myself using YouTube videos and eventually I did a short workshop down at the Anna Templeton Center. Since then I have participated in craft sales at the Anna Templeton Center, Craft Council, Newfoundland, Labrador, and I've done a bunch of rug hooking with school-aged children, mostly grades K to 6, and we've had a rug hooking club. I moved to St. John's in 2001 and I've lived here ever since. I kind of got started with rug hooking. I was at a friend's house and there was a hook mat there by quite a famous hooker, if there is such a thing. And it was a very large piece and I fell in love with it and I was asking her about it. And when I went and looked it up online, because of the amount of time they take, hook mats are quite expensive. So that's kind of what got me started on that path. Rug hooking, just, I'm not a historian, but a brief little bit of history, are traditional to the east coast of North America, Newfoundland as well included. In the past, they were done mostly by women and were made out of whatever scraps you had around, kind of around that philosophy of nothing is wasted. So hook mats are always hooked onto sometimes people use something called monk's cloth. I use burlap. And if you think about sometimes when you buy rice and coffee and it comes in a burlap bag or even vegetables, that was the basis for hook mats in the past. Most people now purchase new burlap from a fabric store, but historically it was repurposed materials. The cloth that was actually used for the hooking, many people now hook with yarn, like that you would knit with. Traditionally, you used strips of material, either old shirts, old clothing, or in the case of the Grenfell mats, which were known up in the north coast of Newfoundland, it was actually old stockings that were dyed and hooked. If you look up online images of Grenfell mats, the colors tend to be quite muted, and it's because they were stockings that were actually dyed by mostly women in the winter months. And during wartime, there were actually ads, so I've heard, and I've kind of looked them up a little bit, that appeared in British newspapers saying if your stockings run, let them run to Newfoundland, and there was a campaign to have those stockings mailed to women on the Northern Peninsula for rug hooking. So what I'm going to do is I'm basically going to show you kind of from how you would start off on your own hooked mat if you're curious about trying it. I spent the last 3 months, most people in the world have found themselves able to go out a lot less and have been indoors a lot more, and here in Newfoundland and Labrador it was winter in March when my job kind of went online. I'm a school teacher. So I found myself with a bit more time to hook, whereas I haven't been able to pursue it so much in the last few years because it is really time consuming. And so if you're ever tempted to try it, this is just kind of a little demonstration, get you started. So what you will need some kind of frame. So I have this one here that already has something on it, but just to show you, it's just basically a big wooden frame. Some people occasionally use a hoop like you would use for cross stitch or embroidery. I use it sometimes. Just one little caution is it's really hard to get the burlap quite tight, and as you start hooking it tends to kind of sag a bit. If you're a beginner, that can be quite frustrating because it's the tension, and when you're pulling the material through really varies, and it can end up with a mat that looks really uneven. So just be cautious if you did decide to use the hoop route. So you need some kind of frame. You need a rug hook. So in the past, it may have been as simple as a bent nail. This one has a nice wooden handle. Some people also use crochet hooks occasionally. It can get a bit hard on the hand. But something like this, they're very inexpensive and they're available at local craft stores, is what I would recommend. And this one's actually not a super fine one. Most of the work I do is not incredibly small, tiny detail. So this one works perfect for me. Burlap, which I purchased. I have used burlap from a coffee bag before. It was quite successful, but it was just the size of the burlap was quite small, so that limited me a little bit. And then I hook mostly with old t-shirts, old sweaters. Here's a piece of one that we'll kind of practice cutting up in a few minutes. This one here is a much finer material that someone gave me. It's a very, very fine wool cloth that when you look at it is kind of woven like material, not like the little loops like you would see on sweaters or t-shirts, and that has some implications. Just to give you an idea of the kind of work I do. So here is one piece. It's kind of a landscape, a little bit hard to hold it up. But rug hooking is very versatile and you can be really like silly and creative, and even lately I've been experimenting with text, trying to see how that would turn out. Here's another one. And again, this is all repurposed t-shirts and material that either people gave me or that my own family grew out of, or that I purchased at a thrift store. Whereas in the past, hooked mats tended to be made out of, your own family's clothing or someone, in your community, when it was no longer wearable. Where we find ourselves in history right now, there tends to be an excess of kind of mass-produced clothing, and it's quite easy to pick up t-shirts and wool textile fairly inexpensively, and it's a great way to reuse some of those logo t-shirts that otherwise a lot of them end up in the trash, in the landfill. In the past, hooked mats were mostly made to go on the floor. They were very practical, also beautiful, but they had a really practical function. The mats that I do are intended to be hung on a wall, so they tend to have like kind of an up and an upside, right side up and an upside down. And sometimes I allow myself to use some material that if it were on a mat on the floor, it would probably snag and get caught. But because that's not the intention of them, I can get away with kind of poofier material, if you want to put it like that. So what we're going to do is I actually have already drawn and stapled my burlap onto this frame, just to kind of save having to go through that whole tedious process. I'll just explain it really quickly. So you do actually also need something like a staple gun. I think you could probably get away with using like upholstery tacks and a hammer. And you literally would just take your burlap, and ideally you want a piece of burlap that's kind of big enough that when you're stapling it, you have enough that you're kind of going around the back and staple it back there. And then the same thing, like this is just a piece that I have here to show you. I'm not actually stapling this on here. And then you usually also, like with this one here, and I'm just gonna haul that out. So I've stapled it all around the back, and I've also put a few reinforcing staples on the front. I try and have them diagonal because I find if you staple exactly with the grain of the burlap, over time while you're hooking, it's really pulling on it, and it tends to pull away like kind of these strips where you trimmed the burlap, where you cut it, and eventually it can actually, work itself so that it's coming loose from the frame. So just something that I've discovered trial and error over time. I don't know if other people do that or not. I actually haven't really had many conversations with other hookers about how they put the material on the frame. You can get really fancy frames that have like this whole lap like component to them, like lap stand. I've never had anything like that. I've just had these ones. And last but not least, I never make a big deal with like stretching. It's not a canvas. People who are artists, you know, stretching a canvas onto a frame is a process. I've never worried about that, and then the burlap doesn't really lend itself to that either. It doesn't really have any stretch, and it's actually damaged on the ends quite easily. So that's never been something that I've been concerned with. Okay, so once you have a frame and you have your burlap on there, you want to draw your image. So I'm actually making this little kitty cat face mat for a friend. It's similar to one I've made before, but I never make them identical. One way that you can transfer your pattern is if you have something on a piece of paper. So say you wanted to do a house next to the ocean. Take your piece of paper, your finished image, you need to leave like a few centimeters of gap. So if you're looking through here, like the edge of my mat is only going to be there. It's not going to be right up against there. It's too hard to hook. Cut a piece of paper about the size that you want your finished piece to be. Start small, because it actually does take quite a surprising amount of time to finish a hook mat. One method I've used, I often just draw directly on the burlap. I'm comfortable with that. But you can actually take a piece of old lace curtain, and so let's say this was my piece of paper. Take your lace curtain, set it down over your piece of paper, take a Sharpie and trace right through the lace curtain over top of what you drew. And then when you pick up the piece of lace curtain, you have your image on there. Then take your piece of new burlap that you've put on the frame, put the lace curtain back down, and if you trace again, of course the lace curtain is full of holes, right? So the Sharpie is going to be bleeding through and going through the holes, and when you lift up the lace curtain, the image is transferred, and you can actually use it multiple times as well. I have used that in the past. Like, I know there's a fish image that I do fairly often, this fairly bright, colorful fish, and I have it on a piece of lace, and I just set it down, trace it, and then pick my colors, hook it, and then if I ever want to do another one, I have that piece of lace there to use a second or third or 10th time. So this here, this particular kitty cat, I just sketched it directly on. I know when I sketched it on, I didn't quite like the way I had done the ear, so I just kind of fixed it up a little bit. If you do that, you might want to use a slightly different color Sharpie or put like an X through the mistake. I'm at the point now where I don't worry about that, but just, you know, to help you get started, that might not be a bad idea initially. All right, so I have stapled my burlap onto my frame. I have drawn my image, leaving enough of a gap so that I'm not going to be, you know, constantly banging up against, and obviously there's no way you can get your hook through the part where the frame is, only the part where the frame isn't. So next, I need my material. This kitty cat is going to be mostly black with like white eye, black pupil, maybe a little bit of pink in its ears. And then the background is going to be a light green. So for that purpose, I have this green sweater. I looked at the label and it was like acrylic and wool. If you have a t-shirt or a sweater or whatever it is, your first step is to cut it up and cut out all the seams, all the labels. If it's a t-shirt with a graphic, you probably want to cut that part off so that you just have the pieces of material. When you look at either the t-shirt or the sweater And it's worth noting here, like a sweater that is like a big bulky knit sweater, that's not gonna work. When you cut it up, it's just gonna fall apart completely. It needs to be either like a boiled wool sweater, felted wool, or more of a commercial sweater with an incredibly fine knit to it. Like this here has incredibly fine knit. So when you look at it, you can see like these series of little V's. And it's actually the same, like when I look at my t-shirt, I can see that on my t-shirt also. They're incredibly small. If you were, so the V's in this are going this way. If I was to fold it this way and cut, when I go to use that material, especially if I'm trying to cut it really fine, so let's say I cut that way, I'm like, oh great, I've got my little strip, I'm ready to go. But when I go to use it, it just shreds. So what you need to do is the direction that the V's are running, kind of fold it against that. In most t-shirts, if you had, like, say I was cutting up the back of this shirt or the front, and I had this piece, it's gonna mean I'm folding it up this way and not sideways. So just fold it a few times. Try and make sure you're kind of sticking with the grain, like don't have it be going like all askew. So just fold it up a few times. You don't want it to be too thick, and you're gonna need good scissors. If you ever were around somebody like my mother, who she had her sewing scissors, and I remember once I took them out of her sewing basket and I cut paper with them, and I got in a lot of trouble that day, and it was explained to me why you need sharp scissors for sewing and why they shouldn't be used for something else, and now I totally get it. So you need a pair of sharp scissors. So these scissors are relatively sharp. So you've got it folded like that, and you literally are just gonna snip strips, probably about not quite half a centimeter wide. It sort of depends what you're doing with them, and you have to be careful if you make them too thin. First of all, your hooked mat will take you forever, and it's also sometimes doesn't hold up as well. So here's my strip. You see all the little V's are running that way. So I'll just cut a couple more of those, and I'm gonna use those for my background. Usually I like to kind of try and cut up my material before I ever start, but I don't always do that. And sometimes partway through I'll be like, oh, I really need, like, you know, this certain color, and I either have to go dig around in my large stash upstairs or even try and find something. There's a hilarious video on YouTube, the well-known rug hooker Deanne Fitzpatrick, and it's, you know, it's a comedy skit of somebody who comes over wearing red right when she needs some red, and by the end she's like there in her bra and undies. All her clothes are getting shredded. So I also want to show you this, because I hook a fair bit. I own this cutter. They're relatively expensive. It would be something, if you discovered that you really loved rug hooking, that you might want to look into. There's different sizes of blades. And what I use that for the most often is cutting really fine material for outlining. You can only cut wool on it. So this is some really nice, incredibly thin wool material. Like, it's light enough you could make a shirt out of it. Sometimes you can get as heavy as like a thin, like, boiled wool blanket, but you need to be cautious about that. Like this here, I cut with the cutter on a thicker blade, and it was quite thick, so I had to be careful that I wasn't working the cutter too hard. But this is really the ideal. I have here a swatch of like pinks that were all cut on that cutter. This was somebody who was doing something incredibly fine. So these are like tiny, 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 and they're all done in different dye lots. So, you know, started off with dark pink, and this would be like if you were doing very fine shading of something floral, or some people even do portraits, but floral patterns are quite common. You would want these like gradual change. And this is the same thing, it's a very fine wool. So just a really quick demonstration of this. Again, much like the, I'm going to use the other pieces here, much like the cutting by hand, there's one direction that works better in this. This is more of a weave, it's not the knit pattern, but there's still, I find if you go one way, they're gonna work out, and the other way, when you tug on them, they just don't have any strength. So I literally just put it here. It's like making pasta. You just have to be careful it doesn't get caught up in the bottom. And usually I would give myself more room, but I wanted to be able to see this in the camera. So you just turn it, and then suddenly you have all these incredibly thin, delicate little strips. Just give them a little tug, yep. So they're good to go. I'll use that for outlining in any hooked mat. And like when you look at, this one here is a good example. When you look at the houses, like everything is outlined, right? And the fish are outlined. Even if you were drawing something and it wouldn't necessarily be outlined, in hooking you need to outline kind of solid objects to give them some definition. So we're just going to actually talk about hooking this for a minute, and then unfortunately I think we're going to be pretty much out of time. So I have this cat face, needs to be outlined. I am going to use, because the inside of the ears is white, I'm just going to outline them in like a dark black. If you're right-handed, you're going to put the hook in your right hand, and basically you find one of the little holes in the burlap and you stick the hook down through it. With your left hand, you're holding the piece of material and you're just kind of putting it on the hook and then pulling it up. This end always just kind of floats free. Later on, you'll cut them all off so that they're about the same level as the hooked loops. You can try and do that now, but you risk kind of pulling it through a little bit. Like this is really fine material, so I'm not going to worry about it. So I basically just have to follow this black line. And you do not need to go in every hole. So you can kind of skip and go, you know, sometimes the next hole, sometimes skip a few. Again, the material I'm using right now is incredibly fine. So I'm kind of hitting more of the holes than I might otherwise. And I'm just literally, hook goes through, put it on underneath, pull it up, over and over and over. And you want to do that until you've either you've finished the section that you're working on, or your material runs out. And just a little, if you ever pull too hard, unfortunately, it all unravels. I'm also a knitter, so one of the things I love about rug hooking as opposed to knitting is if you make a mistake, you can just pull out that section without having to kind of go back in your project. Whereas with knitting, for anyone who knits, if you notice like, you know, 20 rows back that you made a mistake, you have to rip everything out. But rug hooking, you can just take out little sections. So I'm just gonna finish this one little section here, and then in the small amount of time that remains, just talk about some kind of tips. So keeping going, this is a fairly long strip of material. I wouldn't always recommend that for beginning, because again, if you ever pulled a little bit too hard, it's all gonna unravel and then that's the end of it. And again, you can just fix it right away, but it gets frustrating easily. I know that's kind of the #1 struggle that my students had when they were learning how to hook rugs, was that they would accidentally yank a little bit too hard. And just, it's worth noting, if you ever pull the loop up too high, just kind of haul it back down. So you're looking for maybe about ½ centimeter raised. If there's little variations, it really doesn't matter. You're not going to notice in the long run. Just make sure that they're not like really small or really large, or they could get caught, or they could actually get dragged back down. So just looking at the back, right? So that's basically flat, because each time you are putting your hook through, you're literally just looping it around and then pulling it up. When you get to the end of that strip of material, you just pull it up like the first piece and you'll snip it off later. So some tips: do your outline first. Outline whatever area you're working on. So I would outline the cat's ears, the cat, the eyes, the nose. Then I would fill in the cat, whether it was going to be black or whether you'd like a little calico cat or a ginger cat. Also, do your border first. So if you did want a different color border, then you could right away take, like let's say we wanted a blue border. You could right away take the blue and start hooking it, fill in the border, because otherwise what's going to happen is even if you think you're kind of making neat rows that end in the same place, you're actually subtly going over or under each time, and then the edges are going to look raggedy. If you don't want a border and you just want no border but all the background is this color of green, take this green anyhow, hook all around the outside, and then later when you fill in the rest, that it's going to disappear that you even did that. I don't tend to hook like in one direction. I do more kind of filling in, unless the only exception for that is something like this landscape, where you can see that the land is mostly going in this direction and the sky has more of that movement to it. So that would be one exception to that. And the only other really important tip I can think of is don't like cross over behind something else. So let's say I was filling in green here and I was over here and I wanted to keep going on this side of the ear. Don't just jump across that, because if it ever snags, it could pull out other parts of the mat. Cut it, leave the end poking up, and then start again on the other side. And otherwise, if you're ever tempted to try rug hooking, I hope that you have fun. Sometimes the rooms has some rug hooking workshops for adults and children. So I really encourage anyone who is tempted to try rug hooking to give it a shot. It's such an economical craft as well. The supplies can be virtually free. So it's fabulous for anyone to give it a shot, and you end up with these beautiful works of art when you're done. So enjoy.